There is a prayer in the Bible that God did not hear. The man who prayed it was not a criminal. He was not an atheist. He was not someone who had walked away from the faith. He was, by every outward measure, one of the most religious people alive at the time. He fasted twice a week. He tied down to the last herb in his garden. He had memorized the law. He stood in the temple, the holiest building on earth, and he lifted his voice to the God of the universe. And the prayer never reached the ceiling. We will get to that man. We will get to that prayer. But first, I need to tell you about a sin that almost no one ever admits to having, because almost no one can see it when they have it. Anger feels like anger. You know when you are angry. Fear has a shape you recognize, the tight chest, the spinning thoughts, the way the room suddenly feels smaller. Even greed has a recognizable texture. There is something in you that registers it. But pride is different. Pride is the only sin that can feel like a virtue while you have it. It feels like standards. It feels like self-respect. It feels like integrity. It feels like the reasonable refusal to let people walk all over you. It feels like knowing your worth. It hides behind things that look respectable, faithfulness, discipline, a commitment to doing things right. And that is what makes it the most dangerous thing in the human soul. Augustine, the 4th century bishop who understood the human heart better than almost anyone who has ever written, called pride superbia, the turning of the soul away from God and toward itself as the ultimate reference point. Not the self as beloved creation of God, the self as measuring rod, the self as the standard by which everything else gets evaluated. That is what pride actually is. Not thinking too highly of yourself. Not arrogance in the obvious, theatrical sense. Pride is making yourself the center of the story, and then calling it something else. In the next 25 minutes, we are going to walk through 3 portraits of pride that are easy to miss. Because none of them are loud. None of them look like what we usually picture when we imagine an arrogant person. We are going to look at Saul, whose pride wore the costume of obedience. We are going to look at the older brother, whose pride lived quietly behind years of faithfulness. And we are going to look at the Pharisee in the temple, the man whose prayer God did not hear. And then we are going to look at the one person who did the opposite, completely and without reservation. But stay with me, because before we get to any of them, I need to show you something in 2 words that will reframe everything. James 4, verse 6. For words that should stop every one of us in our tracks. God opposes the proud, not overlooks, not gently corrects, opposes. The Greek word James uses here is anatastatai, and it is not a soft word. It comes from military language. It means to arrange yourself in formation against something, to take a position, to set yourself in deliberate opposition, the way a general draws up his troops before battle. When pride settles into the human soul, God does not sigh and look away. He does not wait patiently on the other side of the room. He arranges himself against it, actively, intentionally, in the way a force arranges itself against another force. That is a terrifying sentence, and it is in the Bible. But here is what most people miss about that verse. The opposition is not against you. It is against the structure you built. Pride is a construction project. When life feels uncertain, when approval is unpredictable, when worth feels fragile, when the fear of not being enough becomes too loud to ignore, the soul begins to build. It builds a system, a way of tracking value, a ledger where contributions are counted and comparison is currency, a performance that can be pointed to as evidence. See, I am not worthless. See what I have done. See how far I am from the bottom. God opposes that structure, because that structure is a replacement. It takes the place he was meant to hold. Now, let me show you what this looks like in real time, in a real human life. His name was Saul. You need to know who he was before we talk about who he became, because this is not a story about a villain. 1 Samuel 9 describes Saul as a man more handsome than any of his people, and from his shoulders upward taller than anyone around him. He was impressive. He was chosen. And in chapter 10, when Samuel tells him God has anointed him king over Israel, do you know what Saul does? He hides. They find him hiding among the baggage. The man who was about to become the first king of Israel could not bring himself to step forward. That is not the behavior of an arrogant man. That is the behavior of someone genuinely startled by grace. But something shifted. It shifted slowly, the way things that matter always shift, not in one dramatic moment, but in a dozen small ones, each one barely noticeable on its own. By chapter 15, something has changed in Saul. God gives a clear command through Samuel. Go against the Amalekites. Destroy everything. Take nothing. Complete obedience. No exceptions. And Saul goes. He fights. He wins. But he spares the king. He spares the best livestock. He takes what should have been surrendered. And here is the detail that tells you everything. Before Samuel even arrives to confront him, before the conversation, before the judgment, verse 12 says Saul has already gone to Carmel. And there, he has set up a monument to himself. He built it before anyone questioned him. The monument was not built out of gratitude to God. It was not a thank offering. Saul built a monument to Saul for a victory that was God and Apos' before anyone arrived to hold him accountable. That is pride, not the loud kind, the quiet, architectural kind, the kind that arranges the evidence before the verdict arrives. And then Samuel comes, and Saul says, and this is remarkable, I have obeyed. He says it confidently. He believes it. He has rewritten the story inside his own mind until his partial obedience became full obedience, until his compromise became faithfulness, until his choice became God and Apos' intention. Samuel asks one question. What then is this bleating of the sheep in my ears? What is this lowing of the oxen that I hear? The evidence was right there. It was making noise, and Saul had convinced himself it did not exist. Pride sounds like self-justification. It sounds like a very reasonable explanation for why what you did was actually fine. It sounds like moving the goalposts quietly and then pointing to where the goalposts are now as though they were always there. And here is the part nobody tells you about Saul and Apos' story. His pride did not come from arrogance about his abilities. It came from fear about his position. Chapter 15, verse 24. The moment the mask comes off completely, Saul finally says, I have sinned, for I have transgressed the commandment of the Lord, because I feared the people and obeyed their voice. I feared the people. He was managing his image. He was protecting his standing. He did not want to lose the approval of the army who had just won with him. The pride was not the cause, the fear was. And pride was the structure he built to manage the fear. That connection matters. Because if you have ever found correction hard to receive, if you have ever explained yourself a little too quickly when someone questioned your motives, if you have ever felt a flash of something dangerous when someone else was praised for something you felt you had done too, this is where to look. Not at the arrogance, at the fear underneath it. Luke 15 is one of the most famous chapters in the Bible, and we almost always read it wrong. We call it the parable of the prodigal son. But there are two sons in that story, and the one who never left home is the one who should unsettle us most. You know the younger son and Apos' story. He takes his inheritance early, which in the culture of Jesus and Apos' day was roughly equivalent to saying I wish you were dead, and burns through it in a foreign country. When he comes back, the father sees him from a distance, runs to him, throws a robe around him, puts a ring on his finger, calls for the feast. That is the moment. The celebration has started. And now watch what happens to the older brother. He comes in from the field. He has been working. He hears music and dancing, and he asks a servant what is happening. The servant tells him. And verse 28 says he was angry and refused to go in. Refused to go in. His father has to come out to him. And the older brother and Apos' response is one of the most quietly devastating speeches in all of Scripture. Look, these many years I have served you, and I never disobeyed your command, yet you never gave me a young goat, that I might celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours came, this son of yours, not my brother, not even him, he cannot bring himself to say the word. The distance in the language tells you everything about the distance in his heart. But listen to the accounting in those sentences. I have served you. I have obeyed. I have never, not once, stepped out of line. And where is my reward? He has been keeping a ledger, a quiet, meticulous, invisible ledger, recording every year of faithfulness, every sacrifice made, every night he stayed when he could have left, and he has been waiting, without telling anyone, for the balance to be paid. And here is what makes the older brother and Apos' pride so subtle, so easy to miss. He was not wrong about the facts. He had served faithfully. He had stayed. He had not broken his father and Apos' heart the way his brother had. His record, objectively, was better, but he had turned his faithfulness into a claim. He had taken something that was meant to be a gift, the privilege of living in the father and Apos' house, working alongside the father, belonging to the father, and converted it into a debt the Father owed him. That is what pride does with faithfulness. It takes genuine virtue and turns it into currency. It keeps track. It waits for the payment. And when grace is extended to someone who has not earned it, someone whose ledger is not nearly as impressive, the soul that has been quietly keeping score cannot celebrate. The feast is an insult. The music is noise. The robe on the wrong person and Apos' shoulders is evidence that the accounting system has broken down. Pay attention to this. The older brother is not in a far country. He is standing outside his father and Apos' house. He is 40 feet from the feast, and he is as lost as his brother ever was, just in a different direction. There is a form of pride that the church almost never talks about. It is the pride that lives inside faithfulness. The pride of the person who shows up, who serves, who gives, who stays, and slowly, without meaning to, begins to treat that service as a transaction. And then someone who has not served gets the same grace. And something inside says, that is not fair. If you have ever felt that something, that precise, small, clenching thing when someone less deserving received something you thought you had earned, then you know what the older brother felt. And you know this is not a parable about someone far from you. This is a parable about the part of you that keeps the books. His father says something to him that is almost unbearable in its tenderness. Son, you are always with me, and everything I have is yours. Always with me. Everything mine. The older brother had been living in a house he thought he had to earn. He had never understood that the belonging was already his. The inheritance was not a reward waiting at the end of faithful service. It was the ground he was standing on the entire time. He kept the ledger because he did not know the ledger was unnecessary. Now we come to the man in the temple. Before we read his prayer, you need to understand who this man was in his world, because we have lost the social weight of the word Pharisee. Josephus, the first-century Jewish historian, wrote that the Pharisees held such influence over the people of Israel that whatever they said about religious matters was followed by the community. These were not fringe figures. They were the most publicly respected, most publicly honored men in Jewish society. When a Pharisee prayed in public, people listened. When a Pharisee spoke about God, it carried the weight that only decades of public faithfulness could earn. This particular man goes to the temple, and he prays. Here is his prayer, in full. God, I thank you that I am not like other men, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week. I give tithes of all that I get. That is the entire prayer. There is no petition in it, no request, no confession, no cry for anything. The man came to the house of God and offered God a report card. And here is what makes the prayer so revealing. The measuring stick is never God. The measuring stick is other people. He thanks God that he is not like the tax collector. He thanks God that he is not like extortioners, the unjust, adulterers. The entire framework of his spiritual life is comparative. His righteousness is a ranking, and he is checking his position. This is where we resolve something I told you at the beginning. There is a prayer in the Bible that God did not hear. This is it. Jesus says the Pharisee prayed with himself. He went through the motions of addressing God, but the prayer never reached God. It circled back. It stayed in the room with the man who prayed it, confirming what he already believed, reinforcing what he already felt, requiring nothing and receiving nothing. The tax collector beside him could barely raise his eyes. He beat his chest. He said, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. That is all. 6 words and an ache. Jesus says it was the tax collector who went home justified, not the Pharisee. Why? Not because the Pharisee and Apos' facts were wrong. He probably did fast twice a week. He probably did tithe everything. The older brother and Apos' facts were accurate too. The point is not that faithful people are actually faithless. The point is what you do with faithfulness. The Pharisee and Apos' faithfulness had become the ground he stood on. His disciplines were the floor of his worth, which means that his worth was only as stable as his performance, and his performance required constant comparison to confirm that he was still standing higher than others. Pride, at this level, is not arrogance in the usual sense. It is a survival strategy. It is the soul that decided, somewhere along the way, that love was conditional, that belonging had to be earned, and then built an elaborate system to keep earning it. Fasting, tithing, comparison, report cards sent upward to a God who was being used, at this point, less as father and more as audience. And here is the thing that should reach through the centuries and touch you directly. The Pharisee was sincere. He was not putting on a performance for the crowd. He genuinely believed his prayer was acceptable. He had no idea that the structure he had built was the very thing standing between him and the God he thought he was honoring. That is what pride does in its most spiritually advanced form. It uses the language of devotion to do the work of self-protection. It quotes scripture while building walls. It tithes while keeping score. It prays while talking only to itself. If you have ever found yourself in a conversation with God that sounded more like a negotiation, if you have ever gone to church and left feeling superior rather than grateful, if you have ever caught yourself comparing your spiritual life to someone else and and arriving at your own favor, this is the mirror. This is not comfortable. It is not supposed to be. But stay with me, because there is a reason the corrective to pride is not trying harder. It is not more discipline. It is not more faithful practice. The corrective to the Pharisee is not another fast. It is a completely different foundation. There is a psalm that begins with a sentence that should change everything. O Lord, you have searched me and known me. Not, you have watched me perform. Not, you have evaluated my record. Not, you have measured my output against the average and assigned me a score. Searched. Known. The Hebrew word here is shakar. It means to probe, to examine thoroughly. The way a jeweler holds a stone to the light and rotates it until he understands every facet, every place where the light catches differently. It is the word for complete, unhurried, detailed knowledge. God has done that to you. Before you accomplished anything. Before you built anything worth pointing to. Before you had a record worth reading. He searched you. He knew you. Verse 17 says his thoughts toward you are precious, too vast to count. This is the floor. Not your faithfulness. Not your discipline. Not your performance. Not how well you compare to the people around you. Not the ledger. The floor of your worth was laid before you ever stood on it, by the one who made you and has been thinking about you ever since. Saul did not know this floor. He stood on his reputation instead. When the reputation felt threatened, he rebuilt it by force. Monuments, self-justification, the slow rewiring of his own memory. The older brother did not know this floor. He stood on his service, and when his service was not honored the way he expected, he stood outside the feast and refused to go in. The Pharisee did not know this floor. He stood on his disciplines and his comparative righteousness, and his prayer never reached the God he was speaking to. What you stand on is the most important question in your spiritual life. Not what you believe, not what you say, what you actually stand on when everything else is stripped away. And here is where it leads us. Here is the image that reframes everything. Philippians 2, verse 5. Have this mind among yourselves, which is yours in Christ Jesus. And then Paul describes something so radical that theologians have argued about the details for 20 centuries. Jesus, Paul says, though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped. The Greek word is harpagmon, something to be seized and held onto for the sake of one and own advantage. He did not treat what was rightfully his as something to protect. He emptied himself. The word is kenosis, he poured himself out. He took the form of a servant. He was born in the ordinary mess of a human life, in a province the empire barely noticed, to parents who had to borrow a feeding trough for a cradle. He lived without managing his image. He let people call him a glutton and a drunkard, a friend of sinners, a blasphemer, a fool. He could have answered every accusation. He could have pointed to every miracle, every healing, every word that had never been spoken before or since. He had the most impressive record in the history of the universe. He held none of it over anyone. He washed feet. He touched lepers. He ate with people whose company cost him reputation. He allowed himself to be arrested, tried, mocked, beaten, and killed by the people he came to save, without calling in the defense that was available to him. This is not weakness. This is the most extraordinary strength ever displayed by a human being. And Paul says, have this mind. This is the shape of real humility. Now, here is what real humility is not. It is not self-hatred. It is not the performance of smallness, telling yourself you are worthless so that you cannot be accused of pride. That is just pride running in reverse, still obsessed with the self, still in the measuring business, only now measuring down instead of up. Real humility is not thinking less of yourself. It is thinking of yourself less. It is freedom, The specific freedom of a person who knows what floor they are standing on and no longer needs to perform to stay there. The freedom of someone who does not need the monument, does not need the report card, does not need the comparison to come out in their favor. The freedom of someone who can receive correction without it threatening their identity, because their identity was never built on their record. Jesus could wash feet because he knew whose he was. John 13, verse 3 says it exactly. Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, and that he had come from God and was going back to God, he got up from the supper and washed their feet. He knew, so he could kneel. That is the cure for pride. Not more discipline, not more effort, not more comparison in the right direction. It is knowing, actually knowing, in the bones, what floor you are standing on. It is returning again and again to the God who searched you and knew you before you had anything to show. And resting there, even when you fail, even when correction comes, even when grace lands on someone whose ledger is shorter than yours. So we come to the end. 3 portraits of pride, none of them obvious, none of them wearing the face you expected. Saul, who built a monument before anyone arrived to question him, and then said with a straight face that he had obeyed completely. The pride of the man who rewrites the story. The older brother, who stood outside his own father and Apos' feast and kept the ledger in the cold, faithful, accurate, entirely lost. The pride of the person who turned love into a transaction. The Pharisee, who spoke to God without once asking God for anything, who prayed with himself, about himself, in the direction of himself. The pride of the soul that turned devotion into performance. And Jesus, who knew what he had and opened his hands anyway, who had every right to grasp and chose instead to pour out. 3 things to carry. The first, pride almost always hides behind something legitimate. Saul and Apos' pride hid behind military victory. The older brother and Apos' pride hid behind years of genuine faithfulness. The Pharisee and Apos' pride hid behind actual spiritual practice. If you are looking for pride only in the obvious places, in arrogance, in boasting, in the person who cannot stop talking about themselves, you will miss most of it. The question is not, am I humble? The question is, what am I using to stand on? What is the thing that, if taken away, would make you feel worthless? That is your floor. And if it is not God, you have found where the pride lives. The second, God does not oppose you. He opposes the structure. James 4, verse 6 is not a threat against you. It is a description of what happens when God and Apos' love comes into contact with the replacement you built for it. He cannot leave that structure standing, not because he is against you, but because he is for you too much to let you keep living in something that cannot hold. Every moment of correction, every season when the monument you built gets dismantled, every time you are forced off the floor you were standing on, that is not punishment. That is the God of Psalm 139 making room for a floor that will not collapse under you. The third, and this is the one I want you to carry the longest. You are already known, completely, before this video, before today, before this year, before anything you have built or earned or proved or protected. You were searched. You were known. His thoughts about you are precious, too vast to count. You do not have to perform to stay standing. The floor is already there. It has always been there. It is the floor that the Son of God stood on when he knelt down in front of 12 men who would abandon him and wash their feet. He knew whose he was, so he could kneel. You know whose you are. You are free.